Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Strengthening CRL Global Collections Community Convening. I'm here with our partners from Educopia. My name is Felicia Owens. I am the Director of Board and Member Relations here at CRL. And I'm so pleased to welcome Jessica Meyerson and Katherine Kim, our Educopia Institute consultants who will be leading this work. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to them. Jessica, Katherine?
Thank you so much, Felicia. Yeah, thank you, everyone. It's so nice to see everyone's faces in our little tiny Zoom boxes. But we had a quick introduction and an icebreaker that we wanted to share with y'all. So while I'm talking, please feel free to put in the Zoom chat box your name, where you're located, and either one thing that you appreciate about the place where you live or one word that describes what you're bringing to this community convening. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Katherine Kim, and I'm here with my coworker, Jessica Meyerson, and we are both the co-executive directors alongside our third co-executive director, Raquel Asante, and we are co-facilitating this partnership with CRL, like Felicia had just said. In terms of sharing my own offering, I am based in Charlottesville, Virginia, and one thing that I do appreciate about this place are the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I will share two words that describe me in terms of what I'm bringing, which is good vibes. And I'll pass it off to Jessica to say hello.
Hi, thank you so much, Katherine. We are definitely excited to be here with you all today. We have a lot of information to share. So I think this will be a great call. And today I am bringing grounded optimism for the road ahead.
Fancy. And I'm seeing some really great things in the chat. Spring flowers, bird song, greedy complex history. That's great. That's a really great one. So yeah, it's really great. Please feel free to keep on putting your information in the Zoom box as we're going. And before we get started, I also wanted to say thanks. There have been so many people involved in this process thus far, and there will be a lot more folks involved going forward. We just wanted to take a moment to express our gratitude for CRL staff, folks who filled out doodle polls, folks who participated in focus groups or an interview, folks that sent us documentation to contextualize the conversations that we've been having for folks. I see Jess's laughing face. Everyone that contributed to the documentation that already exists, including committee members, task force members, and global resource program representatives, and every person that has volunteered to be on a sprint team, to review sprint team outputs, to attend this community call, and has otherwise participated directly in this process to strengthen CRL's global collections. CRL community members have been so generous with their time and with their attention, and to everyone here, we are so grateful for your energy and for your participation as we go through this change process. So thank you. To go over today's agenda, we will begin with brief expectations and framing section where I'll provide a few logistical updates and reminders for today's meeting, just setting up our virtual space for this session. Jessica is then going to provide an overview of the CRL Global Collections change process, which started in April of this year, if you can believe it. She will go over the objectives of this engagement, our methodology, the timeline, and the scope of the first phase of this process, which was the discovery phase. In discussing the findings of the discovery phase, where Jessica and I conducted interviews and focus groups, as well as work through documentation, we will review some major roadblocks and also then the actions to take in response to those roadblocks. From there, we'll work through priorities, going over in more detail the next phases of this engagement, and then spend time together in a Q&A section. In setting up our virtual space, we would love to see you, but we welcome you to turn off your camera if that's going to be more supportive and if that's going to enable you to participate more fully. Please turn off your mic in the large group until we get into Q&A. Please feel free to eat, stretch, and move during this convening. There will be requests for engagement through polling and questions via the Zoom chat box. And we will, including Jessica and myself, practice shared accountability for this virtual space being mindful of how much space that we're taking and creating for others, and through active engagement and listening. Some post-meeting logistics. So folks, if there are things that you don't catch, please don't worry about it. We are recording this session, and the recording and the slide deck will be available on the new Strengthening Global Collections webpage, which Felicia will share later. We will aim to answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A section. However, we will also be capturing questions to ensure that if they're not addressed during the call, they'll be addressed in future communication. And we'll also be sharing a very brief follow-up survey where you can then document any remaining questions that you have. And we'll also share links to the recording and the slide deck in the email that we sent to you. So with all of that said, I will pass it off to Jessica Meyerson.
Thank you so much, Katherine. So let's take a closer look at the reason that we're here today, which Katherine has built a runway for us to dive into, which is the CRL Global Collections change process. So we want to remind everyone, and we're also aware that everyone on the call may have had different levels of exposure to information about the process up to this point, just based on your positionality and relationship to CRL, which I realize many of you have multiple relationships with CRL. So building on the work of the last few years, this change process is sort of precipitated by work of the CRL board, of the CSPC, the ICCG, and CRL staff. This is about a community-driven and concrete recalibration process of CRL's global collection activities, which we like to define at this point as a kind of plurality of overlapping and interdependent functions, actions, and relationships. The approaches that Educopia, Katherine and I specifically, are using during this process include surveys, brief surveys, touch points, interviews with specific interview protocols, focus groups with specific focus group protocols, full community convenings such as this one of several that we'll have throughout the rest of the process, and facilitated work sprints. The key overall process outcomes include a clear scope and value proposition for CRL's global collection program, or global collections or global resources programs, which will be represented in the impact model, which we'll talk a lot more about later, and a coherent vision for change, as well as an implementation plan with explicit benchmarks and milestones. Next slide, Katherine. So this slide, again, this is part of the overall process, shows this running from April to November 2023. And it is important to note, however, that while many priority actions are going to be accomplished by November through this process, the entire change or recalibration process will not be fully complete by that time. We will review the scope and the key objectives for each phase during this call, with the intention of clarifying for everyone, and it won't be the last time, what will be done by November and then what will be on that longer implementation roadmap. Another way to think about this process is to use a corkscrew analogy. So this is, we have some similar big questions about how we want to move from where we are now to where we want to be. And while we may revisit those questions again and again, each time we revisit them, we come at them with new information and new understanding or meaning making from that information that informs next steps. So iterative translation of synthesis into shared understanding, and then alignment and action. And Katherine and I kept our introduction short at the beginning because we thought that this moment was actually probably the better place to articulate why Educopia is engaged in this work and what we bring to the process with all of you. So our work is foregrounded by our community cultivation framework, which is available on our site, and we can share the link with, along with other resources that are likely to be published to the Strengthening Global Collections webpage that was mentioned earlier, and that you all will see the link to likely multiple times. over the course of the call in the chat box. And if you skip to page 12 of that framework, we have kind of a matrix that helps to highlight how our growth areas and organizational development or community lifecycle phases work together to help guide strategic actions in the next step towards organizational or collective cultivation and development. So we work with groups that are large, like CRL. We work with groups that are small. But all of the groups that we work with, there's a common thread. They share the belief that collaboration allows us to accomplish what we can't accomplish alone. Most of our work since 2006 has been multi-institutional or multi-organizational efforts that are looking to address a field level challenge. And this could include distributed digital preservation, library publishing, copyright challenges to software preservation, and interoperability among services or tools in our digital curation landscape. We also partner with information organizations on change management, which is necessitated by creative, economic, and technological trends in the information landscape. Additionally, Educopia Institute has served as a fiscal sponsor since our founding and has expanded that capacity in recent years. So our partnership with CRL actually combines many facets of the work that Katherine and I have the privilege and the pleasure to do, and we look forward to the road ahead with all of you. Next slide, Katherine. So before we move on to talking specifically about phase one of this process, let's check in. So this is not a range or a scale. This is just kind of two big buckets. Given everything that's been covered thus far, also I should mark, this is the first in a series of check-ins that track back to the expectations that Felicia and Katherine set in terms of engagement in the Zoom chat box. So this is where we start practicing our check-ins with you all. So in response to the statement, I understand the scope and expectations for today's call, as well as the high-level scope and timeline for the global collections change process. Where are you landing? So you can put your response in the chat box. No, I don't understand. Yes, I understand. So just giving everyone a minute to kind of sit with that question. See some yeses rolling in. Some yeses. This is great. And we're just tracking that because we want to be sure that we're repeating in our communications throughout this process and continuing to refine and provide greater clarity for areas that are not well understood. So we appreciate you all for participating in that check-in. Next slide, Katherine. Okay, so phase one. Phase one is the phase that we're currently in. It is also known as the discovery phase. And the reason for today's convening is really to focus on our findings from this phase and talk about how they feed into subsequent phases, as well as immediate next steps. So this is an overview. We, as part of this discovery phase one, we spoke with representatives of stakeholder groups, including AMPs and GRNs, external affiliates, board members, committee and working group members. We conducted 7 focus groups. We conducted 9 interviews. In total, we talked to 41 different participants. The time range for the discovery period of interviews and focus groups went from April 17th to May 10th. And the discovery phase is now officially completed as of this community convening. So we should also say methodologically, we did prepare a protocol in advance that we used consistently for both interviews and focus groups. These key topical areas were in common across all of those discussions, although some of the wording of the questions may have varied just based on the particular gifts, skills, experiences, or roles of the person or people that we were speaking with, or their relationship with CRL. But the core set of interview questions or topics covered included the positioning of global collections within CRL's mission and priorities, and trying to get a sense of how well the scope of global collections activities were understood. We were looking at where collections and equity intersect. So if members of the broader CRL stakeholder community had specific examples within their own work with CRL or elsewhere that they were pointing to as sort of a guide or exemplar for centering equity in global collections activities. We also looked at and discussed with many people what they were seeing as the broader trends of greater importance in terms of challenges facing collecting institutions and associated opportunities, but then a level up from that, broader trends that are accelerating or amplifying those challenges and opportunities. And those are trends that are existing at a higher level that I mentioned before: economic, political, environmental. We then looked at what CRL is best positioned to do in response to those challenges and opportunities, and talked about the type of information that could be used to inform collective collecting priorities, as well as to measure the impact of collective collecting efforts. And finally, we engaged with all of our participants on the topic of sort of proficiencies, characteristics, gifts, skills, however you want to parse that, for leadership in strengthening global collections. So really looking at the staffing requirements or kind of the qualities of a person that might be in a position to lead CRL global collections to the next phase. So one of the things that we always do when we talk about the applied research is we want to make sure we're explicit or transparent about the limitations of discovery phase 1. Which is from the very beginning of our engagement with CRL, the community has been very explicit, and we greatly appreciate this based on our own kind of professional orientation, that the sort of key constituents or ultimate beneficiaries of a lot of the work that's happening are researchers. So this could be students, these could be K through 12, undergrad, these could be postdocs, these could be early career faculty, these could be senior faculty. We did send out 6 to 7 invitations to people that sort of cross-cut, people that had research questions that span national borders, whose work required them to be able to conduct research in other languages. And we also received some recommendations from members of ICCG. We have not received any responses from folks yet, but I will say, and this will probably be reiterated, we were asking for people to join us in these discussions at a time when, if you're a TA, for example, grades are due, or if you're a faculty member, grades are due. And many of you operating in academic organizations understand that better than anyone. So all this is to say that Katherine and I are still committed to securing what we might call a researcher roundtable, because that feedback and those ideas are going to be relevant and inform our understanding of next steps for global collections activities at almost any point of the process. And we think that there are some creative ways that we can incorporate them into conversation. Okay, Katherine, next slide. So these are some key findings from the discovery period. So here it is. And then we're going to parse what these mean in terms of actions for really the rest of the call. But at a very high level, we want to share some takeaways with you. So one is global collections activities at scale are really perceived as core to CRL's unique value proposition within the research library landscape. However, the scope and resourcing of those activities are not well understood by all stakeholder groups equally, because activities, relationships, and ways of working have organically evolved over the last 2 or 3 decades, right? No surprise there, that happens. So that's one finding. Broad environmental, economic, political, and technological trends are creating conditions that require stewardship or institutions to coordinate their stewardship efforts, particularly global collections efforts. So this is also, some of this will be a different iteration on some of the key trends, themes, and concerns that people have articulated in other community convenings, including Greg's keynote back on the 28th of April. Given our current realities, CRL is perceived as best positioned to leverage its scale to coordinate, track, and help steward collective global collection development efforts among research libraries in measurable ways toward an equitable knowledge commons. And so in ways consistent with the ICCG call to action. Given what CRL is best positioned to do moving forward, and with a high degree of consensus regarding the desired impact of CRL Global Collections activities, new structures and workflows will need to be implemented that enable CRL, and that CRL must define the scope of support that it can sustainably provide across its global resource programs and work with partners to adjust workflows accordingly. And I want to emphasize being intentional about finding ways that all global collecting activities can benefit from what sets them apart, right? So finding scale and finding efficiencies, but also leaning into the really interesting and unique and remarkable things that sort of distinguish those activities from one another. So scale is an expertise amplifier. And then finally, given what CRL is best positioned to do moving forward, and with a high degree of consensus regarding desired impact of CRL global collections, global collections activities governance needs to be reevaluated and possibly redesigned to be fit for future purpose. So these findings point to a very specific and coherent vision for change. Right? So we're already attending to one of the major outcomes of this overall process. And Katherine and I would articulate that coherent vision for change as moving from collective action to collective impact. Katherine, next slide. So as mentioned earlier, we asked all of our interview and focus group participants some variation on the question of CRL's current scope and purpose. And as covered in the findings slide, there was general consensus that global collections activities at CRL and collective collecting more generally are really unique to this association. Reiterating some of what Greg said in his keynote, right? A research library and association, in some ways a cooperative. And others have said, it really pushes beyond interlibrary loan, something beyond shared long-term storage, but really finding ways to open up the collections of member libraries. Others have said CRL is the vehicle for collective action, a convener, a space to think about broader trends and issues that are more challenging to solve as a small group, bringing together librarians from world regions in a way that they are not brought together elsewhere, both cross-nationally and cross-linguistically. So we followed that question, again, with the challenges and opportunities. And then we asked again, what role is CRL best positioned to play in addressing some of those great challenges to collecting institutions and collections in the 21st century, given its history, its strengths, its capacity, its size, etc.? And we asked this question to reveal both possibilities as well as directions for refocusing. So collective action is more effective when attention and resources are focused. So in some cases, respondents elaborated on their first answer, and they specified roles or actions that they wanted CRL to take to more fully leverage its scale and its positioning, And in some cases, people actually suggested roles that would be new commitments for CRL, but always in ways that sharpened the focus of the association for greater impact. Across the board, however, the vision for change that emerged was this move from collective action to collective impact. And the difference between those two is key. And here's what it is. Collective action is defined as a group of individuals making decisions and, doing activities in the service of a goal that they share in common. But according to Menker-Olson's 1965 collection action theory, which y'all don't have to look up, but it's on Wikipedia and elsewhere, they point out that a group of individuals attempting to provide a public good, which is what all of you are trying to do and are doing, often has difficulty doing so efficiently. So put another way, the fact that action is happening in a collective way, it doesn't speak at all to the impact of those actions or the alignment between the actual and desired outcomes of those actions. Collective impact, on the other hand, is a response to the challenge of effective collective action. It involves a backbone organization to provide centralized infrastructure and coordination of individuals and organizations that share a commitment to a common agenda and continuous communications. The backbone organization monitors activities across the system using a shared system of measurement, whatever meaningful measures the group determines on their own. So that is not prescribed top-down. Checking for alignment and realignment of mutually reinforcing activities. And there's a structured and broadly understood process for driving the common agenda towards the desired impact. So, with all that said, and with this coherent vision for change that's moving from collective action to collective impact, let's check in. Katherine, next slide. So, which two aspects of the move from collective action to collective impact are you most excited about? So you can pick 2 out of these 7. Just put the numbers in the chat box. Are you interested in learning more about this backbone coordinating piece? Are you interested in thinking about this common agenda for change, which is the impact model, which we'll talk about more as kind of version 1 of that? Are you interested in what constitutes mutually reinforcing activities? What are you most excited about what you've heard so far? And I'm going to look to the chat box for y'all to tell us. 2 and 7, common agenda and thinking expansively about long-term partnerships. 4 and 7, open and continuous communication. Yeah, I see a 1, the backbone. I see the 5, which is the mutually reinforcing activities. Yeah, these are great. It looks like a lot of people, there's almost complete consensus in the chat that regardless of whatever number folks picked, a lot of people are picking number 7, right? Okay, this is great. Thanks, everyone. Okay, Katherine, next slide. So now that we've established that this entire change process, that this coherent vision for change is geared towards moving CRL from collective action to collective impact for global collections, what are the roadblocks that we need to address? Okay, so the first is, and I want to point out to each of you what is on this slide before I go through it. So you can see that the roadblocks are listed, and I'm going to talk about those, and then we're going to move forward because we're going to break these down. But I do want to note that in parentheses, parenthetically, and emboldened, you'll see specifically when during this process, these different roadblocks from moving from action to impact are going to be addressed. So, and probably not for the last time, but explicitly during these periods. So first and foremost, establishing a shared understanding of the current situation. Now, there is a lot of kind of latent consensus forming based on everyone that we've talked to and all the documentation that we've read. And we'll talk more about this in just a second. We talked just for a moment about this backbone organization piece and what that's all about. But we're also going to talk about CRL Global Collections as a system. So that's a piece of shared understanding that we definitely want to hold together. We're also going to talk about fiscal sponsorship clarity. And I'm going to leave that one to Katherine because she'll go into a lot more detail about that, but that is all tied in. Also defining the version 1.0 of the common agenda. So this is really about naming explicit strategies for moving from the current situation to the desired impact for CRL's global collections. And that is really the core focus of the impact model sprint. Governance, staffing clarity, and additional resourcing. These are questions we're holding, and there are some medium-term questions or near-term questions to be answered, medium-term and longer-term. And some of that a big chunk of that will be addressed in the sustainability model sprint. And then finally, the longer roadmap for implementation, which I alluded to earlier, that there will be priority actions that are accomplished by the end of this process. And then there will be actions that continue on that roadmap well past November. Okay, next slide. So let's start with the first roadblock, the one that I mentioned. And again, since we're already touching base on that backbone organization piece, and we're touching base on sort of, where CRL's positioning, the positioning of global collections, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about CRL global collections as a system. So I want to offer up a caveat with this. I know there are many ways to present or represent a systems diagram, so y'all bear with me. This is the graphic design is not my area of expertise, but hopefully just by seeing these different components in space relative to each other, we can start to build this understanding. So to state the obvious, the system of global collections activities is part of the CRL system. And that CRL system includes other activities, right? Running a library, facilitating interlibrary loan, right? Running the association. And CRL operates inside of that larger research library landscape, observing and responding to the ways in which that landscape is evolving, mindful of how its activities are distinct but complementary from the work of others in that landscape, including the work happening at individual member institutions. And that research library landscape is being shaped by broader trends in higher ed, and yet more broadly, again, these like externalities, these political, economic, environmental, and technological trends that are being shaped by and shaping society as a whole. Next slide, Katherine. But within global collections, there are three primary system components that we think it's important to highlight today. The first is governance and decision-making. The second is administrative and operational infrastructure. And the third is models of collective collecting. Next slide, Katherine. The governance and decision-making components of global collections include the following. And again, caveat, imperfect at best. However, moving to a shared understanding of both the complexity of the system and how its components interrelate. So governance and decision-making includes mechanisms such as the global collection platform, the actual technological platform, which is used by global resource programs, and the workflow of approvals that's built into that system. Also, decisions made via distinctive governance models of current global resource programs themselves. CRL leadership and staff is another area where decisions are being made every day that are feeding into this system. Purchase and proposal programs, such as the purchase proposal program or the demand purchase program. While these are not exclusive to building international or global collections, some of the materials purchased through those programs are part of global collection building. And CRL board owns CRL strategic direction through its committees and provides oversight of the executive director. And then CSPC and its International Collections Group are both specific governance bodies instantiated to oversee and drive vision for global collections specifically. Next slide. Okay, all right. I know we're starting to run out of boxes here, but bear with me. So the administrative and operational infrastructure components of global collections include financial, so budgets, purchasing, stewardship activities costs, organizational operational costs, including staffing, accounting, audits, financial reporting. There's a lot of activities embedded in that one. Licensing and copyright. So that is its own function within the CRL system that has direct relevance to global collections activities and building, but not exclusive to global collection building. And that's another way of saying that all of these functions are represented between, and I may get this number wrong, but I want to say between 1 and 3 staff members, right, per function. And though that staff capacity has to be distributed across all of the activities that implicate that function. So again, technological infrastructure, managing domains and hosting, into, managing a DAMS or a descriptive system. Strategic partnerships, assessment, field level tracking. There are many functions here that are all part of the administrative and operational infrastructure of the global collection system. Okay, next slide, Katherine. And then finally, and Katherine will talk about this more a little bit later too, but in the beginning, the goal of the global resources programs, the GRPs, as they were called in their first instantiation back in 1996 as a cohort with the exclusion of camp that's been around much longer, which again, Katherine will sort of review this timeline a bit later. It was really to make dispersed collections more interdependent and complementary through coordinated acquisitions combined with powerful systems for access, discovery, presentation, and delivery. Thank you, Deborah Jacobs, who has published a really, really helpful history of the AMP GRN Global Resource Programs and their evolution over time. And the reason that we bring that up is because in the beginning, each of the groups represented and were intended, they were designed this way, to represent different models of collective collecting. So digitization in a country of origin for reference work specifically, and that went along with training for international partners to do that digitization. We also saw in another group the creation of a field level searchable index of materials not widely held in North America. Yet again, in another group, we saw building really specific resource discovery linkages between different institutions and within and beyond North America on specific topics. And then we have establishing a distributive cooperative collecting scheme that played to local collecting strengths of participating regional institutions. So again, in the beginning, this made sense. What you were really looking at that time was the design of a kind of incubator or a sort of co-lab where organizations could test different approaches to collective collecting that accounted for regional and cultural context. Now, fast forward to 2023. These very different approaches now also implicate different governance models, different platforms and systems, different systems of communication, and all of those differences imply different levels of support from the administration and operations component, as well as different decision-making structures. So with all that said, let's check in. Katherine, next slide. Where do you place yourself in the system of CRL Global Collections? What components of this system are you most heavily engaged or invested in? So you could pick more than one number, but just like you did last time, put your numbers in the chat and that will reveal to everyone in the call kind of where everyone is coming from and your different relationships to CRL Global Collections. Lots of threes. Oh yeah, ones and threes, ones. Yes, this is so good. Yeah, so we're coming from all parts of the system, okay? All parts of the system. So with that said, I'm going to hand it off to Katherine to talk about fiscal sponsorship. Katherine, take it away.
Thank you, Jess. So to start this section, I just wanted to go over the definition of fiscal sponsorship so we're all on the same page. In very, very broad terms, fiscal sponsorship is a relationship where a tax-exempt organization provides administrative support and fiduciary and legal oversight to another group that doesn't have its own nonprofit status. And that tax-exempt organization is often called different things. So if you are doing any research or if you want to look at other fiscal hosts, you'll see them referenced as fiscal host, fiscal sponsor, administrative host, but fundamentally it is all in the fiscal sponsorship model. And why is this definition important? This is just the first step in developing a shared understanding and shared vocabulary around CRL and some of its global collections activities. The quote on this slide is from CRL's website, which notes that CRL provides an administrative umbrella for programs and promotes cross-fertilization and economies of scale. The definition of fiscal sponsorship underscores the fact that fiscal sponsorship is a formal relationship. There are lots of norms and expectations, and there are lots of resources and examples out there. And the great thing about all of that is this provides more structure and more context for the CRL community to use and to review. Many of the questions that people are holding about CRL as a fiscal host will be answered with a better articulated fiscal sponsorship program. So I just wanted to define this as a way of, this is the vocabulary that we'll use, and this is the context with which we'll be talking about some of these programs. Jessica referenced this just now in her overview of the discovery phase, but I just also wanted to reiterate, because CRL has become a fiscal host to groups of varying sizes, varying needs, varying streams of revenue over the course of decades, this model naturally doesn't scale. The image on this slide is just a very condensed timeline to give folks a visual of the historical context of CRL as a fiscal host. So the first AMP, the first Area Materials Project, the CAMP, was founded in 1963. In addition to the subsequent AMPs, the Global Resource Programs, which were initially incubated at ARL, moved to CRL in 2006. So in this discovery process, and for this community call, we received questions around AMP and GRM budgets, as well as questions around specific pain points and administrative and operational challenges. Essentially, and this is just a reframing of what Jessica said earlier, not having a defined and articulated fiscal sponsorship program and working on activities like membership management, accounting activities, event planning, project management, infrastructure maintenance, all with groups having different workflows and different practices, results in structural challenges that impact multiple departments and staff members working in functions across the whole organization. So really just to reiterate the structural challenge that we're dealing with when we're talking about a program that has evolved over decades. Like models that might have worked in the past need to be right-sized for the present. So while preparing for all of this, we kicked off a fiscal sponsorship working group with CRL staff, and that work is going to carry over into the next phase, phase 2 of work. That staff fiscal sponsorship working group is starting the work in creating a container for CRL's fiscal sponsorship program to articulate and to answer the questions that AMPs and GRNs are currently holding. So as this work is happening, CRL staff is in the process of scheduling and meeting with AMP and GRN chairs to do budget reviews. And for this working group, staff are also currently documenting and reviewing the current situation to craft a formal structure, like a program structure for fiscal sponsorship. So to go back to the beginning of this presentation, in harnessing the unique strengths of CRL, streamlining administrative workflows and practices, building capacity for mission-driven and mutually reinforcing activities, and clarifying the relationship, expectations, and responsibilities of both the fiscal host and the sponsee will then allow the organization to then leverage what CRL is best positioned to do. In addition to that, defining the shape of CRL's fiscal sponsorship program and its activities may also partially address other roadblocks, including infrastructure and stewardship backlogs in improving workflows and articulating clear expectations for global resource programs. That work may also be supportive in addressing the ongoing buildup of materials that can't be processed in reasonable time. It will also support staffing clarity. So while the recruitment of core global collection staffing will begin during this change process, clarity about additional CRL staffing priorities, skills, and experiences most needed to drive collective impact will be determined over time, as CRL and its global resource programs transition to new information and new workflows of clarified and formalized fiscal sponsorship. So I also just wanted to share this very exciting piece of news. So in addition to this note about staffing clarity, CRL is also actively working on launching its hiring process for a director of global collections. And on that super exciting note, I'm going to pass it back off to Jessica.
Thank you, Katherine. That is super exciting. I know that's a question a lot of people have been holding. Is the timeline for the director of global collections. So hopefully that's one question that gets answered with greater specificity coming soon. So not months, but closer to weeks. So with this, we're going to talk about the transition from phase 1 to phase 2, which is, again, the impact model sprint. Now, For the impact modeling work that will be undertaken in phase 2 by the impact modeling sprint team, I want to be clear again, we are not starting from a blank slate. And I mean that as a good thing, as a great thing, right? We're already starting with a lot of documentation and work that's been done by staff, by committees, by working groups, by individual kind of communications between different people in this global collection system. And so we have a pretty well documented and rounded understanding of the current situation. We also have an emerging consensus around long-term desired impact of global collections activities. And again, this is really another way of saying that is, what is the change that we want to make or be part of making through CRL global collections activities? So again, this current situation is looking at, right now, we're at a stage where we have like field level components to our status quo or current situation, which we talked a bit about earlier. And then we have organizational or association level kind of current situation. So the work, next slide, Katherine, the work and desired impact, again, desired impact. So what you're going to see in these bullets is just a variation for the most part on the ICCG call to action, right? Translating that call to action and those bullet points from, these are things that we want everyone to be responding to, both in a CRL context, as well as in our member institution context, as well as in specific program contexts, to let's go ahead and articulate this as the change that we want to make together through the vehicle of CRL global collections activities. So next slide, Katherine. Okay, so then what is the focus of the work? The focus of the work, given that we already share a working definition for both the current situation and the long-term impact, is to clear another roadblock that was mentioned on the previous roadblock slide. We're going to define the strategies and activities that are moving us from our current situation to the desired impact for CRL global collections. So this will look like what is often referred to as a logic model, which is a representation of what you may have heard, if y'all have heard this term before, or if not, it doesn't matter, but just in case you run across it. A logic model is a visual representation of a theory of change. So if you're Googling out there, you might come across these terms, and they're all interrelated. So often referred to as a logic model, this type of representation is intended to communicate how an effort or initiative, logically speaking, is supposed to work. It explains why your strategy is a good solution to the problem at hand. Effective logic models make an explicit, often visual statement of the activities that will bring about change and the results you expect to see for the community and its broader constituencies as part of that. And a logic model keeps documents in the effort moving in the same direction because it provides a common language and a common reference point for what everyone is driving toward. So the impact model sprint is going to kick off mid-June. Invitations to that are going out today. We're actively working on scheduling. Many of you have asked who's going to be involved, and just to second the expression of gratitude that Katherine shared at the beginning, we're so grateful and floored and enthusiastic about all of the volunteers, people that wanted to be engaged in these sprints. So the names of the sprint participants will be shared when everyone's availability has been confirmed. Overall, sprint participants will be composed of representatives from CRL staff, AMPS and GRNs, board members, including members that are also in CSPC in some cases, the ICCG, and other stakeholders. The series of meetings, what will it actually look like? It will look like a series of meetings, 4 synchronous calls with asynchronous work between, followed by community review. So next slide, Katherine. So again, the deliverables for phase 2, which we're going to be moving into after today's community call, which wraps up phase 1, After the impact model draft is prepared, again, there will be a community review process with the impact model later being finalized and then handed off to the sustainability sprint group in the next phase, which is phase 3. There will be another community call likely in August, which will discuss the work around the impact model. So for each phase, we will be having a community convening that touches on and elaborates what work was done, what questions were raised, and what the result was. So all that said, while the impact model sprint is happening, the fiscal sponsorship working group, just to reiterate Katherine's timeline, the fiscal sponsorship working group will be working to create that broad program structure, resources, and shared expectations for fiscal sponsor and sponsees. And over the course of this work period, staff and AMP-GRN chairs will meet to discuss the budget. They will also work through and discuss parameters, and also acknowledging right now that what we're building is we're building this shape, but the model is designed with the intention to be flexible and extensible and to refine over time, right? So with all of that said, y'all knew we warned you that this is going to be information heavy session, right? Let's check in. Let's take a beat. So for this check-in of the phase 2 activities, the impact model sprint, which are you most excited about? So just pick a number. You could pick 2 if you wanted to. You're not limited to 1, but what are you most excited about? Is it seeing this explicit mapping between strategies, outputs, and impact? Is it just about having this common language and reference point? Is it about seeing and understanding whatever the shape of fiscal sponsorship is going to be? Or is it something that's not even listed here? So I'm looking in the chat and I see I see a lot of 3s. I also see some 1s. I see a 2. Yeah. I don't see anything yet that's not already listed here. Yeah. Okay, this is great feedback, everyone. Thank you so much. Okay, well, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Katherine, and she's going to give y'all a preview of what comes in phase 3 and phase 4.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, just like Jess said, I'm forecasting basically what we'll be working on in phase 3 and phase 4. So the sustainability sprint, after the impact model sprint and like that group finishes its work, will kick off in July or August. Similar to phase 2, in the subsequent phases, the names of sprint participants will be shared when everyone's availability has been confirmed. And with our impact model from phase 2, clearly outlining the strategies and the activities that need to be undertaken in order to advance from the current situation to the desired impact for CRL global collections, we can then work on the next roadblock, governance clarity. So governance design, or reimagining governance for global collections, will be a focus of the work for the sustainability sprint team. And deliverables from this sprint currently include a finalized value proposition statement for CRL global collections, a global collections governance redesign, and recommendations to the board for resourcing impact model strategies and activities. In transitioning to phase 4, the implementation road mapping sprint will likely begin in September. The implementation road mapping sprint team will produce a timeline with benchmarks across all major streams of implementation. So fiscal sponsorship will involve establishing a healthy backbone and setting clear and explicit expectations for CRL staff and CRL global resource programs. Governance, the aim to be fit for our shared context and the impact that we want to advance. Communications and outlining who is responsible for communicating what information and at what cadence. Staffing to articulate which new gifts and skills will contribute to this effort, and infrastructure and shared measurement. Like, when do we define the shared system of measurement, and what is the process of doing that? What is it? And very importantly, how we are all held accountable to do those things and to participate in our roles. This slide reflects the projected timeline for community review. The general cadence of these sprints will be during every phase, the sprint groups will produce major deliverables, whether that's the impact model or a value proposition statement or the implementation roadmap. There will be a period of community review before the documents are finalized. And we also just wanted to mark that July, August, and October are likely going to be those touch points. And I also wanted to note, because this is all contingent on people's scheduling availability, there may be moments in this process where we either need to slow down or speed up. These month markers are really just to give everyone a sense of what the pacing will likely be like. So that's just the one caveat that I wanted to put in there. And like we said earlier, we will aim to answer as many questions as we can. We have half an hour. However, like if we don't answer your questions, or if you're holding questions at the very end, they're going to be addressed in either future communication, and we'll give you the opportunity to put those questions down in writing in a very brief follow-up survey. And as folks are thinking about questions, I did want to raise questions that have already been asked, and thank you to folks who've sent these in advance. There was a question about what opportunities for broad community input will go into the Educopia process. So I'm just going to return back to this slide and just note, like, there will be three major opportunities for the community to provide feedback, and we'll also have convenings for us to work through and talk about them. We also had a couple of questions regarding AMPs and GRNs, and I'm going to fold all of these together because I think they package neatly together. So there were a couple of questions around specific organizational aspects, activities, and/or workflows of the current AMP and GRN model that need to change. And then a question that very nicely dovetails into that would be, how would a new model bring greater depth and breadth to global collections while leveraging the coordination and efficiency that CRL could advance during a time of resource constraints? So a well-articulated and scalable fiscal sponsorship program will address these pain points and help leverage the opportunity that CRL has as the role of a convener and as an expertise amplifier. Currently, the administrative and operational infrastructure challenges are a result of the fact that there are differences in, and this is just a repetition of what I said before, but things like membership management, accounting, event planning, project management, and infrastructure maintenance. And having those differences essentially results in those large structural problems. And the fiscal sponsorship working group is currently working through that, and it's led by staff asking these questions and working and defining the shape of what that program could look like. And as they're doing this, they are also meeting with AMP and GRN leaders to not only review the budget, but I think in terms of the future work, we'll be working closer as they set the expectations between sponsee and sponsor. But I also wanted to pass that off to Greg because I know that there's more information that you could provide in terms of the work that you're doing.
Oh, sure. So I just wanted to give a quick update on the financial position of all of the AMPs and the GRNs. We've been doing a lot of work on this over many, many months to get clarity on this issue. And where we are now is we are rolling out information to each AMP and GRN group individually, because we were tempted, earlier in the process to just talk about the finances with all the groups at once. But what we realize is that each group is particular and needs particular attention. So we shared some financial information with the South Asian Open Archives group, SAWA, a couple of weeks ago, and we're scheduling a meeting on the book so that the team here can meet with the executive committee and do a deep dive and have a conversation exploring all of their finances. And by the end of this week, the goal is to get initial financial reports, the invoices, outstanding collections, the whole picture to all of the other AMP and GRN groups. And I'll say, and then schedule a meeting for the team here to meet with the executive groups of all the individual AMP and GRNs to have a deeper dive conversation about what's going on in those numbers, and so we can build clarity around that. So we're already rolling out that information, and that's going to happen very, very quickly in the days ahead, not weeks ahead, the days ahead.
Thanks so much, Greg. I am going to stop my screen sharing and open the floor for any questions if folks want to either unmute themselves or put questions in the chat. Oh, Deborah, thank you for that comment. That's definitely yes. This is a simple scheduling question, but for the community convenings, can the community get more time between the announcement of a meeting and the day of that meeting? Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. We really appreciate folks for being here with that much notice. But now that we have a cadence, I think it'll be easier for us to be able to forecast these meetings much earlier.
Sure. So Jeremy Ott of GNARP asked about the scheduling the meetings with the leaderships of the AMPs and the GRNs. Just say that the goal is to get the information to the groups in a way that's going to be productive. So we'll work with it. We'll work around. Whatever the scheduling challenges are, we'll work around it. Or whether that's using, email and using asynchronous platforms to communicate information, and then also just being available and flexible in terms of with groups. But so whatever the challenges are, Jeremy and other AMP and GRN groups will one way or another we will address it. So Julie's point here is I just want to lift that up and for visibility, because it not only for the very tactical efficiency that Julie points out, but actually that issue that Julie's pointing out speaks to a larger point that's been a big part of the conversation today, is the complexity of the systems we're navigating. So we have folks working with us through the AMPs and the GRNs. We have multiple different projects and partnerships. And when it comes to the administrative units, say the accounting teams here, oftentimes we're working with accounting teams at local institutions, and there's complexity and complications there. So Julie needs to get this information that crosses many different departments and folks within Yale, and she needs that to get to her in an efficient packet. So Julie, yes, we'll work on that. But that just, your point really illustrates just the complexity in terms of the system, right? And when folks work with just one part of the system, you may, not realize just the level of complexity and that's involved. So Julie, absolutely, we will do a better job of packaging up this information so we can get it to accounting departments and senior decision makers in a more rational and manageable manner. Yes, absolutely. So I'm just going to dive into the weeds one more time on this because the weeds are super, super important. So invoicing, it may sound like something just so in the weeds and basic, but my goodness, it is incredibly complex. So for instance, CRL membership, we only bill annually. And that means we bill every year. And we're billing 200 different institutions. Now, what happens is that the member reps, where that invoice goes across these 200 institutions is always changing. So we can't count on the same staff being there every year. And then to make it more complex, different institutions will say, hey, can we pay a year, 2 years, 5 years, 6 years in advance? Can we bundle up a group of different invoices together and pay, a chunk here and a chunk there? Can we use different fund codes? Can we use title, can we use Title IX funding or not, right? And so what happens is that a simple invoice, right? If you add, just CRL, then you add on 11 different groups, then affiliated programs, the complexity is astronomical. And that's one of the reasons why we need to get together through this process to align, not just on strategy and operations, but just to get a better handle on some of these administrative issues. Nobody wants to be focusing their time on administrative issues, but the challenges we have right now are we just really need to get a handle on this. And that point that Marisol raised is that resonates super strongly for a lot of us. We're hearing this from a lot of members as well.
I'm curious if I can ask a question of the group. I know we don't have a slide for this check-in, but let's do this as maybe let's do this as a yes, no as well. You know, whichever one you're leaning more toward, which is did today's community convening, the first of several, address a lot of the questions that you were holding before you came to the convening? Can everyone take a pass at responding to that question in the chat? So were a lot of the areas of maybe misunderstanding or opacity or things like that that have been articulated by different stakeholder groups over time? Did people get some of their core answers or some of their core questions addressed? Yes or no? Looking to the chat to see what y'all have to say about that. This would be great feedback for all of us. I'm not seeing any yes, no in response to that question, but I do see Ksenia's response here. During the discovery phase and in compiling the key takeaways, you synthesized commonalities. Do you have a sense of where among the focus groups and interviewees there were differences in the vision for CRL? How would ignoring these differences, many marked by work in the field, make it challenging to move forward with change? Yeah, that's such a great, and Judith, thank you for the yes, at least some. Ksenia, that's a great question. And I will take a pass at responding to your question. And then I'll invite Katherine to also sort of elaborate on whatever I'm about to say, which is that part of what I shared earlier in my section was that there are still kind of very distinctive and unique features of these different groups, to your point, Ksenia, that they're kind of like sites or points of learning, right? There are things that maybe some of the other groups could benefit from, like a group has really figured it out, or a group has really figured out and built strong and deep relationships with institutional partners in a particular region. And those relationships are hard to build and maintain. So these kind of different components of how I read, like what is distinctive and what is unique, not just what is in common. The way we would respond, and I think Katherine said this several times, is that we can't get to a place where we leverage that distinctiveness for the benefit of the whole system until we start to identify areas of streamlining and administrative commonality. So it's not that that's not where we want to go. In fact, well articulated, Ksenia, that's exactly where we want to go. We want to get to the initial promise of these global resource programs, informing each other through best practice, really kind of like a network effect in terms of impact. But to get there, we have some basic things that have to happen first, just to address what we might call kind of like cumulative technical debt that organizations accrue over time when programs are evolving organically over several decades. So I think your point is well taken. And I attempted to emphasize that that's the ultimate goal, is to really try and leverage both the distinctiveness as well as some of the efficiencies in process. So Ksenia, I don't know if that helps to answer your question, but I would also invite Katherine to respond to that as well, and any of our CRL colleagues.
Mhm. I mean, I think definitely to what you said, and this dovetails quite nicely to Kiro's question, or point about wanting more details, and agreed with Ryan as well. What we'll try to do, and I think maybe the website, the web page for this engagement might be the best place to put it, is working through what fiscal sponsorship is. Because there are a lot of details. There are a lot of documented details in terms of some of the things that even Greg just mentioned in terms of membership models and revenue, things like that. That's a very common note that we can make in terms of what fiscal sponsorship programs look like, what hosting looks like, in terms of especially what the services are, what the activities are, and what the engagements and the relationships are. So in terms of the specificity, we'll definitely take that note, and we'll be able to probably put that somewhere online. To share.
Another way, yeah, and Katherine, actually, another way to build on Katherine's response and to sort of reiterate what I said before, Ksenia, is in order to leverage the unique distinctions between each group that are actually quite remarkable, we need to create capacity. And the way that we do that is we create capacity through the streamlining and recalibration of administrative and operational infrastructure first, if that's helpful. So I'm looking, let's see.
Oh, I also want to clarify the roadblock.
Okay.
The roadblock is the fact that there is no program structure right now. That is the roadblock. That is the big issue, not the sponsees.
Yeah. And Kirill, to Kirill's question about visioning but not building. So to your point, Kirill, we know where we are, and we actually have a lot of documentation about where we want to go. But the core work of phase 2, which will be the work of the impact modeling sprint, is to address exactly your point. What are the specific strategies and activities that move us from where we are to that broader vision? So yeah, the devil is in the details, to your point. I wonder if Greg or maybe Greg, would you like to speak to Sarah's question about how some of the proposed changes might help to stabilize staffing?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Absolutely happy to talk about that. So I think that through the conversation today, my expectation is that folks are getting a sense of the sheer complexity and the administrative challenges with the current situation. And so, being on site in this organization, in this building over the last 4 years, this is something that I'm very, very, very aware of. And what happened in terms of staffing, I know that we have a huge capacity issue and huge gaps in our staffing right now, particularly in global collections. And what I said to the board of directors, though, at the meeting in December, we met December 9, because we had a conversation among the board about, hey, look, CRL, if we're anything, we're collections. And if we're anything, we're global collections. What gives? You don't have a senior collections person. And what I said to the board then, and I stand by it, was that I absolutely was not going to hire a director of collections into a system in which they would not be able to be successful. And where there was just such a high degree of ambiguity and operational challenges that it simply needed board and frankly my attention to get the system structured in a way that where they could actually get traction in their roles and be successful in a leadership position. It needed to get along the way to get to design a better structure for building global collections before we could hire someone into it. And based on what we've done now, where we are now in the process is I am comfortable now saying we're far enough along. We're not out of the woods. We're still deep in the woods, but at least we have a path working together to get out of it. That I can hire a director of global collections. We can hire a director of global collections now and bring them into the system with confidence that they're actually going to be brought into a system that they can actually get traction in and lead in effectively. So, so Sarah, the part of the sequencing is we go through this process to design a better system, and that will allow us to recruit, retain, and grow a whole suite of staff in our global collections, rather than bring people into a system that we know isn't designed optimally, in fact, is broken in many ways, and then just try to sort of say, buck up, right? We don't want to do that. We want to get the system right. So I think this goes hand in hand, and we're far enough along to get that search going right now. And it's going to be the beginning of a whole suite of staffing. I want to hire a director of global collections and then give them capacity to allow them to hire their own team. So it's going to be a pretty exciting position. Brian talks about not, cautions us not to conflate GRNs and AMPs, and I think he's absolutely right about that. In fact, I would argue I would go even further than that. After looking at this with some detail over the last several years now, I would even conflate GRNs with each other, and I wouldn't conflate AMPs with each other. Like it really is. Each group is in fact unique. But I do take, there is a meaningful difference between the GRNs and the AMPs. And that's why designing different models for fiscal sponsorship is so important, because what we can do is we can design a fiscal sponsorship arrangement that speaks to the specific needs of every specific group, but it also allows us to have clarity across groups, CRL, the group. We all know what the relationship is. Right now, we don't have that clarity. Are we acting as a fiscal sponsor? Are we a fiscal agent? That's a legal distinction that affects how we file a 990. So that's not a situation that I, in my position and the board of directors, could allow me to be in the position to say, yeah, it's good. We can just keep this going as it's going. Now that we know the ambiguity in the structure, I am ethically bound to fix it. So Brian, you're absolutely right. We don't want to conflate groups. And with the fiscal sponsorship model, we can design something so that we all get clarity on what the relationship is and what the expectations are. I don't think we'll ever get certainty, but we can at least go for certainty for the auditors and for our accountants.
I also want to respond to Kadil's question. For those of y'all that are still here, around distinguishing between roadblocks. Are AMPs GRN a roadblock, or how are the roadblocks distinctive? And I'm going to put this in reply, and I want to repeat it for everyone because it's a really important question, and I think people have been holding it. We want to be clear. The AMPs and GRNs are not the roadblock. The roadblocks are all these things that are in the way of supporting and amplifying this deep work and other global collections activities outside of AMPs and GRNs, right? In accomplishing this shared vision for impact, which will be clearly articulated and documented as part of the impact model sprint. So we do want to distinguish the roadblocks. The roadblocks are those fiscal sponsorship shape, administrative and operational structures, governance clarity, staffing clarity, some ways of thinking about how to sustainably provide the appropriate technological infrastructure to support some of these outputs, all of those pieces that we've been discussing throughout the presentation. Pamela, thank you for your question. and comment. Yeah, so for those of you that can't see the chat, Pamela's asking, it still seems challenging to think about the global areas of CRL disconnected from CRL in general. How are the global collecting programs fitting into the other program strategies and vision for CRL in general? A more holistic approach might be more effective. So yeah, creating structures that will help with all kinds of collecting and stewardship needs that benefit from collaborative approaches. I +1 that, Pamela. I'll give others, CRL staff and leadership an opportunity to respond to this. But I will say, and definitely Katherine, who of the Educopia team has been working most closely with CRL staff on this fiscal sponsorship working group, that is effectively the idea, is to think about a shape or a container for these activities, a way to set expectations, to clearly delineate boundaries so that everyone has clarity and can behave accordingly and more easily coordinate. Once that shape is there, once that fiscal sponsorship kind of definition is in place, it provides an opportunity to think about exactly that. Like, how do you use that vehicle to start to identify activities that CRL could undertake as like a backbone organization for things like tracking trends across different programs and doing exactly what you're saying? How do we effectively apply what we're learning here, or what needs to be adjusted to building capacity for other stewardship needs or benefiting other collaborative approaches? So I think that this does more than one kind of work, is how I would both like reiterate what's been discussed so far and also sort of respond to your question and comment. Katherine, do you have anything you'd like to add to Pamela's thought, which, yeah, greatly appreciate.
It's just an extension of what you were saying, in that creating a program provides more opportunities to be able to do this kind of cross-pollinating work. If only, and some of these sound so basic, but even in terms of things like communications or having reporting, there are so many things that go into having a well-functioning program that I think it will actually feed into having all of this go into CRL's larger organizational vision. And that's, I think, was one of the reasons why Greg is also in every single sprint team, is for us to make those connections together.
And I just want to jump in super quickly and just say I am in passionate, emphatic, in universal galactic, agreement with what Pamela, says. This whole approach is to design a holistic collections and services program, CRL wide, and centering, the global collections community as part of it. So that's exactly what this is intended to do. Bring together, and I see some folks on the call that I'm thrilled to see. So I saw Maggie Saperano is on the call, and I know Maggie mostly from working through neural and licensing activities, but having Maggie here really brings, sort of represents having that collective approach. So it's area studies, licensing, it's a holistic approach to CRL collection building and programming. So that's exactly what we want to do. And I also just want to, this may be awkward, but let me just say this and own something. Somewhere in the narrative, and this is on me, I am firmly convinced it's on me, this narrative got out there that the AMPs were a problem or are a problem to be fixed. That's not the situation. That's not the situation. What the situation is that CRL is this incredible cooperative enterprise that's had a number of programs develop organically, over decades. And this is just a moment where we take stock of where we're at, come together as a community and just design a better mousetrap. But there's no problems to fix. I mean, that are targeted. The problem to fix is the whole mousetrap. It's all the whole system we're operating in. So 100% yes, holistic approach, bring it all together. And the global collections community is just you are CRL, CRL is you, and we're just going to work this out all together. Absolutely.
Oh, I also know that we only have 4 minutes on the clock, but I did want to remind folks that we are recording this conversation and we will also be sharing the slides online and folks will be getting an email from that. That's just a note. And I also did want to thank all the folks who said that it would have been useful to have some pre-reading or have things sent to them in advance, which we definitely took a note of. And I think we'll aim to do for our future work.
100%. Really appreciate that suggestion. Okay, everyone. Well, we're not seeing any new questions come into the chat. So just to reiterate Katherine's expression of gratitude and to start and end with that sentiment, which is very sincerely felt by Katherine and I for the opportunity to partner so closely with all of you, to learn and develop a deeper understanding for the work and all of the roles or hats that you wear within this larger CRL system and global collections activities. And to say there's more to come. Expect to hear more from us at regular cadence, along with partners and colleagues within CRL staff and leadership. And so with that, Felicia, do you want to close it out?
Yes, I will reiterate again, thank you all so much for joining us today. It's your participation that makes these community convenings so both possible and successful. And of course, our immense gratitude to Jessica and Katherine for leading us through this process. We're thrilled to continue working with you in the coming months. Again, there's a link in the chat for the kind of landing page where we are keeping every step of this process. So the recording will be forthcoming. Future events, future community feedback periods will all be published on that page. So bookmark that and keep it handy for future reference. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Take care.